truly, the wonder of it is that we are here. And I think that we are here, again, and here we can refer to the archaic concepts, because the archaic concepts tells us stories about what happened back then. And if you begin to look into the mythology of the universal mythology, you discover that there are certain recurring motifs. And of all of the mythic stories, the epic stories that have been handed down of old, the one that is the most prevalent of any other is the idea of the total destruction of the world by water and the virtual annihilation of the human race. We, of course, that's the story we learn in the Judeo-Christian tradition. We're usually not told in Sunday school, though, that concept, that tale is shared by, 100 other societies around the planet and through history, or more than that, and that there are many, many variations on the tale. And the other thing, probably one of the second most prevalent stories is the idea of a future apocalypse. And of course, again, if you take the Bible, and I just use that because that's so intrinsic to our own culture, and everybody is at least somewhat familiar with it. But the Bible reflects the universal stories that you find in the Vedas, and you find in the codices of the Mayans, and the Egyptian tales, and so on. But it begins with a catastrophe. It begins with a great deluge, which the Greeks called cataclysmos, which was the destruction of the world by water. And then the narrative ends with ekparosis, the apocalypsis, which is the destruction of the world by fire. So if you take this whole historical narrative that's in our Bible, you can see like two bookends: the destruction of the world through water, the destruction of the world through fire. And when you begin to turn to other cultures, you discover the same concept. Like I said, the Greeks, the terms I used were Greek terms because they had exactly the same concept. Except that if you read Plato, Plato is a good source of information. He talks about there being multiple catastrophes, which of course has been scientifically confirmed. And he tells the story, probably most people in here are interested in the story of Atlantis. And most of what we know about Atlantis comes through Plato. I would say probably 95% of our source of information on Atlantis comes through two dialogues by Plato, Timaeus and Critias. But in there, he tells the story. The story goes that they're sitting there at the Socratic Forum. It's Socrates, Timaeus, Critias, Plato, and perhaps one other unidentified individual. And they're all telling stories. It's a round table, and each one is supposed to tell us an enlightening story. And when it comes to turn of Critias, this is Critias the younger, he tells the story that he heard from his grandfather, Critias the elder, who in turn heard it from his uncle, Dropidas, who in turn heard it from Solon, the Egyptian poet and lawgiver who did a 10-year exile in Egypt, roughly 100 years before Plato's time. While in Egypt, he heard the tale of Atlantis from elderly Egyptian priests. And in Plato's account, he describes how the priests were somewhat belittling Solon because in the Greek traditions, they only knew about one great catastrophe, whereas these Egyptian priests knew about multiple great catastrophes. And the Greek tales only preserved the memory of the most recent catastrophe, and that would be the catastrophe, the Great Flood of Deucalion and Pyrrha, his wife, who survived this great event. And if anybody wants to read and get a really good dose of the archaic tradition, read those two dialogues of Plato. In fact, at some point I'd like to come up and just do a whole presentation just on Atlantis. But the prerequisite would be reading those two dialogues. And the thing about Atlantis is that if you follow the evolution of the Atlantean literature from what I call the Atlantean Revival was the 1882-1883 work of Ignatius Donnelly. Anybody familiar with Ignatius Donnelly? Congressman from New York. He ran for Congress so he could get a seat in Congress that allowed him to get down to Washington, D.C. so that he could get into the Library of Congress and research Atlantis. How about that? which probably to me is probably one of the more preferable motives for running for Congress that I could think of. Anyways, so he did a lot of research in the Library of Congress. He wrote 2 books, Atlantis, the Antediluvian World, and Ragnarok, the Age of Fire and Gravel, where he drew upon the Norse traditions of destruction. And he saw the parallels between the Norse stories of Ragnarok and Plato's story of Atlantis. But I sort of call that the Atlantean Revival. His 2 works became immensely popular and then spawned a whole sub-industry of Atlantean research that from roughly the 1880s down to the 1970s focused primarily on a literal reading of Plato's story, looking at his specific details. And of course it was Plato that put Atlantis in the Atlantic Ocean. Well, with the advent of plate tectonics theory and ideas of continental drift in the 1960s and 1970s, geologists took the position and even wrote, in the 70s, there was a book that came out called Atlantis, Fact or Fiction, and it was primarily edited and conceived by geologists who set out to essentially put this whole Atlantean heresy to rest. And they concluded in there and made the statement that there's no geological evidence whatsoever that anything like Atlantis could have ever existed in the Atlantic Ocean. And if you follow the Atlantis literature up to that point, what you see is that there's a major transition then that follows in the wake of this presumed geological dismissal of Plato's details. And what that was is that you suddenly had this proliferation of researchers going, we've located Atlantis. It wasn't where Plato said, it was in the Mediterranean. Now never mind that what we're calling, the Mediterranean Santorini is only 900 years before Plato's time instead of 9,000 years. All we have to do is assume that Plato made an error in translation, and he said 9,000 when he really meant 900. Then it was placed in Anatolia, Turkey, then it was placed in Cuba, then it was placed in Britain, it was placed in the South Pole. The geographic locations of Atlantis probably number 24 different places, everywhere except where Plato said it was. Well, a number of years ago I thought, let's go back and reread Plato and see. Take what he says at face value. I read an account about the history of geology, and somebody said Plato was the first geologist, and I thought, okay. So I went back and I read the 2, and I actually procured copies of the original Greek and began to go in to try to actually translate some of the words and so forth that he used. I came to the conclusion that his timing being off by a factor of 10 was bogus, because he repeats the same date multiple times in there. And the geography, they tried to say, well, when he was talking about the pillars of Heracles, he didn't really mean the pillars of Heracles that separate the Mediterranean from the Atlantic. He meant these 2 islands over here in the eastern Mediterranean. Or there was many variations on that. So what I've done is I put together an Atlantis program that takes line by line Plato's account as if it really was accurate information. I've set that next to the cutting-edge research on marine geology in the Atlantic Ocean. And guess what? Plato's account confirms, the modern science confirms Plato's details continuously, one right after the other. His timing, his placement, his description of the geography, it all fits. Interestingly, does anybody know the date that Plato gives for the final demise of Atlantis? I know some of you that have, what was it? What was the date that he gave? How many years ago? 11,600 years ago. And as it turns out, scientists, geologists, and climatologists and stuff have discovered that something very extraordinary happened 11,600 years ago. Precisely the time that Plato places the sinking of Atlantis. And one of the consequences of this extraordinary event was, you see, at 11,600 years ago, we were right at the end of what the geologists call the Pleistocene epoch, which is characterized by this swinging back and forth between full glacial ages and interglacial ages such as we're in now. And the last great glacial age came to an end between 11 and 13,000 years ago. And within that transition from the glacial age into our modern interglacial age, there were two extreme events that occurred. One of them at 12,900 years ago, which you'll see that date relates precisely to the timetable of the Great Year. And the second event was at 11,600 years ago, which conforms precisely to Plato's timing for the final demise of Atlantis within this great geological catastrophe that sank Atlantis. But he also, if you do a careful reading, he also describes it simultaneously. There was a catastrophe around the Mediterranean that destroyed the pre-Hellenic culture that had been in this great war with Plato. So this is a really great example of how modern scientific findings are confirming. And to my knowledge, only one or two geologists have recognized the connection. One was Cesare Emiliani, who wrote, he was a guy who back in the 70s was studying deposits on the floor of the Gulf of Mexico. And he realized that there had been a gigantic flood that had come down the Mississippi River off of this catastrophically melting ice cap. And so he carefully dated the sediments that were washed out. In fact, half of Louisiana are these sediments that were washed down at this great flood, and he placed the date at 11,600 years ago. And he said in an article that was actually published in the mainstream scientific press, curiously, this is the same date that Plato gives. Could there be a connection? Well, of course, if there are great floods of melting ice into the ocean, it means that the ocean level is rising rapidly. And that rapid rise in ocean level is going to have consequences, especially if there was an island culture that had evolved on islands near the mid-Atlantic ridge. So that would be a really good, to me, one of my favorite tales is to get into that story of Atlantis. So that would be something that we could do as a future program, maybe do a whole day just on deciphering Plato's Atlantis account.